Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medlir, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Hello, this is your host, Chris Lamont, and I'm excited to be here today with Medlir, who just returned from the UN Summit of the Future in New York and has a lot to share with us about what took place behind the scenes and also what we can look forward to in the AI governance space going forward. Now, just as a reminder, on September 22nd of this year, UN member states adopted a Pact for the Future that includes a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations. Although this pact and declaration go far beyond AI and digital governance, the future-oriented approach taken at the summit offers the potential to redraw global governance. Of course, Secretary General Antonio Guterres saw the need for reform to be extremely urgent. He stressed, "We cannot create a future fit for our grandchildren with a system built by our grandparents." So Medlir, what are the most important observations you have coming out of this summit?
I think you summed it up. And hi, Chris, by the way. I guess I didn't say hi.
It's good to see you again.
It's good seeing you. But I think you summed it up in that statement by Secretary General Guterres. It was actually very palpable. The session was actually, the first day was Friday, and it was all run and directed by youth. And there was a very poignant moment when Secretary Guterres, in a way, urged those present, the young people, to take power away and not to expect to be given that power. And then he pointed out the fact that youth and young people throughout the world must be exigent, meaning they need to get involved in politics and have a say. Because at the end, these rules, as you pointed out, are rules for the future. And it's a future that belongs to those people, and perhaps a little bit to us, but certainly not to a lot of the people that are there currently setting up those rules and guidelines. But this actually also goes to a bigger question, or rather a bigger sentiment that I came out of the UN Summit of the Future. And that is, our listeners will remember from last episode on this, when we were introducing some of the topics, there was a sense, and still is a sense, that the multilateral system needs reforming, that the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN needed, in a way, boosting up. You needed more new commitments to achieve them, or a different way of going about that. And that ultimately emerging technologies were challenging, right? Reality in ways that we had anticipated probably prior to that. And so the summit and the conversations and the pacts all in a way go to this. So there was actually, apart from the AI and digital power space here, there was an agreement, at least in principle, that there needs to be a UN Security Council reform. Now, this meant for skeptics be like, okay, there was an agreement, but it's never going to happen. 5 years ago, nobody would even mention that there was, nobody would even agree to having a document that mentions the need for reforms. I think it's a step forward. I think that's a positive thing. There is also a commitment. There was a lot of financial resources were committed to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then thirdly, this goes hand in hand with the main subject of our conversation today. One of the instruments for achieving those development goals was seeing emerging technologies. And there were a lot of meetings, especially on the sidelines, that I participated in, but also there were other conversations I was not in as well, that the main question was, how do we bring the benefits of emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, digital technologies, to the global south? And that was, I would argue, one of the main themes over at the first 2 or 3 days of it, whether it was in Africa, whether in Latin America and other places. Incidentally enough, I was actually from New York. I went to DC, and I was at another event where the main focus was on Latin America. And there was a demand, especially from countries in Latin America, for more engagement on the part of the United States, that saying that the main offer was in a way being made by China, and the United States was just staying on the sidelines. So there is a sense, like I said, that these emerging technologies provide us a generational opportunity to both develop globally, but more specifically to address some historical inequalities and legacies. And one of them is the lack of development across the global south. And so I'd argue that if there was one big takeaway, was a huge emphasis in that direction. And actually, let me also, in line with this, I attended another meeting, which was also on the sidelines. This was on the record. It was hosted by the Liechtensteinian delegation at the UN on the side. And there was a presentation made by the Munich Security Conference about perceptions in the global south with regards to the global north. And this perception of hypocrisy, especially in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine and then Gaza. And then there seemed to have been a double standard, especially on the part of the United States. And so what I took away from that was that whereas in the past, let's say a long time ago, people in the global south or anywhere, let's say, loved the West or the global north. I don't know if that's too strong a word. But then they stopped loving them, but at least they respected them. Both of those sentiments have disappeared. In fact, even fear has disappeared as well. People in the global south are fed up. And I think many of them now are speaking up and they're saying, listen, we're no longer going to just sit back and just wait for you to tell us what to do. We must take this in our hands. All of these just come hand in hand. And there's a sentiment that we are at a turning point, an inflection point, or whatever you want to call it, in terms of global governance and multilateral institutions.
That's really interesting. And first of all, of course, the Global South is a very broad label that often is applied to sometimes like a shifting group of countries, right? Depending on how and where it's being used. But one thing that you get to there is it seems that there is this absence of trust. And I think this is difficult when looking at putting meat on any of these particular commitments and also seeking to engage with rivals or those who are pursuing or promoting alternate frameworks or greater access to technologies. You mentioned in the context of Latin America, digital competition between the United States and China. Is there also a crisis in trust, meaning that if countries like the United States were to start doing some of these things that you were implying that the U.S. should be more aware of, is the U.S. a desired, trusted partner, given the wide range of implications that adopting a digital infrastructure from a particular part of the world has?
Yes, it's a catch-22. And then I think, as you pointed out, the Global South is such a broad term. Obviously, alternative, we can call it developing countries, but most of them, economically, at least we know that many of them are in the Global South. And this point that you raise is a very interesting one because during this meeting in Washington, D.C., I did turn to one of my colleagues and I said, I wonder how those countries would react if the United States was actually more proactive, given its history.
That might not be what these countries want.
Exactly. So it's a difficult situation here in terms of where the United States is, but even the Europeans. So when I say the West, it's not just the United States, it's Europeans as well. A lot of countries in Africa are not very happy with the French presence there, or with the legacy of, let's say, British colonialism or whatever else you have. And so, yes, it's a difficult challenge. And actually, it was very well exemplified. And I want to be careful how I frame this, but there was a meeting about AI development in Africa. And there was a serious emphasis that we need to make sure that this is development in Africa's terms. It's on their terms. It's how various African countries and regions and how they want to develop with it. But on the other hand, there's also recognition that there needs to be some financial element to this, that some infusion of both technology and infrastructure, that most of that's going to come from the global north. And so that it's a very delicate balance where that has to be struck here. I think it's possible to do it, but it is a difficult one, and partly because of the past and because of the moment in which we are with the tensions between Russia and the United States and China and the United States, then this makes these debates even more like higher stakes. And so I think I'd say that is part of the challenge here.
Absolutely. And you think about some of these proposals, right? We've talked in the past about issues like data colonialism, the idea that this is an even playing field and the provision of this infrastructure in itself is not necessarily neutral.
Yes.
These are a whole lot of issues.
Just on that really quick, because I did raise that question in a couple of settings, data colonization, like in terms of, because there's a push on the part of these big tech companies to create data localization. So to localize data from those countries in that country, it may not be the best approach. And some have pointed this out because as it's been happening recently, and let's say in Mexico, there are farmers in Mexico that are having low yields from their crops. And now you add another very energy inefficient, let's say, data center in that region. And all of a sudden there are energy demands and water demands that already are not sufficient for meeting agricultural needs, but now you're shifting them in another direction. And so, and of course, the benefit, who gets the benefits of this? And that's the challenge. And I think that's in a way what the Pact for the Future is trying to do as well. It's trying to say, look, we need universal standards on this. And so there's a meeting actually in San Francisco in November of this year where I think under the direction of the ITU, where they're going to discuss standards. And then there'll be a series of meetings throughout the world to move forward with these regulations.
It's interesting. Often those in the human rights field talk about human rights being interdependent, but also if you think about this discussion here in terms of sustainable development,
right.
It's very difficult to have a discussion on sustainable development or even climate change without bringing in elements of the digital compact.
Right. No, absolutely the case. And again, this is a challenge because a lot of this, unfortunately, we know from the past, and I'm pretty sure it's happening right now, the real impact of these data centers and others is being underreported. And I'm really concerned whenever I think about development anywhere, not just the global south, but anywhere in the world, I don't think we're taking into account the huge demand for energy to the point that you have Mark Zuckerberg going to the White House or Sam Altman going to the White House and asking for a small nuclear reactor or something like that so they can train their models, right? That underscores the demand for energy that these kinds of, and the irony is that give us this and let's just burn up as much as we can, and then we'll use these models to solve the energy crisis. There's an irony in that formulation, but unfortunately that's where we are, and I don't think we have taken that seriously enough.
That's one important aspect of this compact, but also I want to ask about another issue that is in the compact on global digital cooperation. And that's the move towards, or affirmation, I should say, open and accessible data, an endorsement of open source data, models, and standards. We've talked in the past about some of the cybersecurity implications of this particular approach to data governance. What are your thoughts on this particular commitment?
I think I have questions about its applicability, or rather its viability politically,
right?
Whether in fact this is something that can be achieved to have open source data, models, and standards. Now, I think that some of this may not happen on the front end, but it will probably happen in a roundabout way. We were discussing before going on air this case. I think it's happening now in California, in San Francisco,
right,
where OpenAI has been sued by a plaintiff because the plaintiff argues that OpenAI is using some of its data for its training data programs. And now the judge has actually decided that the plaintiff has the right to go. There's certain limitations, and I don't know how feasible it is, but it has the right to go and to, without any notes, without computers, only at one computer, to actually observe all the data that OpenAI has trained. But I don't know, again, I don't know how effective that particular step is, but I guess the importance of that case is that if everybody insists on that right, that at some point it may become unfeasible to have closed data. At some point, you're like, what? We must have open data source, or else we're just going to be inundated at all times with these demands and requests. And so that's one response I have to that. I don't know that I am optimistic about having a universally agreed upon open data standard on that. I don't know. What do you think about it? How do you feel?
Right. No, I think that this made me think of a separate case that comes probably from more the publishing world, where you have agreements reached between publishers and those trainers of large language models that exclude the producers of academic texts, researchers, and the such, and the ability to exercise influence in this process seems from the perspective of those individual creators and producers of text to be very limited, because you do have that gatekeeper, that intermediate level entity that can make agreements with these companies that are seeking to access data to train their models. So in addition to the energy intensiveness of this, you have a broader economies of scale in terms of who owns the rights or who can sell rights at large for large amounts of text, which makes the challenge that you mentioned one that is exceedingly difficult. But I think it's interesting that you brought up California, because California was supposed to be the state that was going to pilot the landmark piece of state level legislation.
How did that go, Chris?
Right. So it was the hope last year was that it would be the first in the United States safety measure for some of the largest AI systems created in the country. And it seemed like it would pass. It would pass the California state legislature. This was SB 1047. And some were even talking about it as like a blueprint for national AI legislation. And in particular, what this legislation sought to do was put in place guardrails for some of these large AI models that are being designed and brought to the market. So one, you could make tech companies liable for harms caused by their AI models, and also ensure that the AI companies were able to turn off their AI models should they be misused for some purpose. But while it looked like there was a lot of support for this, including initially from the governor's office in California, it seems like OpenAI, among others, won the argument at the end of the day. And to quote OpenAI's chief strategy officer, Jason Kwan, who argued SB 1047 would threaten growth, slow the pace of innovation, and lead California's world-class engineers and entrepreneurs to leave the state in search of greater opportunities elsewhere. And do you think about this argument? This is one we've heard parallels, of course, analogous arguments being made in the lead up to landmark pieces of or attempts at regulation of AI in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, I was actually shocked. I thought for sure that Governor Newsom would actually not veto it. This would go forward, especially in the context of the elections in November. And because there's been a lot of talk about misinformation, disinformation, and making sure that you don't recirculate. And I think Governor Newsom pointed to that he now no longer, right, such things would actually be allowed. But it seems that this particular version, at least this particular bill, was not up to par with what he wanted. I do wonder whether Governor Newsom is upset, I think, with his own party for having overlooked him as a presidential candidate. And so he's just taking it to everyone. That's a different conversation altogether. With the legislation stalling at the state level in the United States, there is another big piece of legislation. It's very important, I think, to highlight for our listeners. And this is a bill that was introduced not too long ago, I think last week, by Senator Markey. It's called the AI Civil Rights Act. This is meant to mimic a little bit the EU AI Act, although it's not as, so to speak, demanding on producers and developers as the EU AI Act. But the idea is to, and I'm quoting here from Raymond Sun, by the way, who's a fantastic source for whoever wants to track regulation. So this is his analysis of it. So I'm just going to quote from his analysis. But the idea is to seek to regulate algorithms used in consequential actions via mandatory pre- and post-deployment audits, assessments, transparency rules, and individual rights to appeal algorithmic decisions. The bill also calls for strategic items, for example, digital service algorithm auditors, and a study on algorithm explainability requirements. Now, the notable thing here, of course, it's not going to be the last word on this issue, and I imagine by the time it becomes law, if it ever does, it'll be stripped a lot of the stronger language around it. But it is an important first step. But I think also it's a shot across the bow, like in the sense of, look, you have options. You can go your own, like, and try and do this on your own as industry leaders. Make sure that you, with open source, may be one solution to that. Or legislation is going to come one way or the other. I actually had a conversation this last week while talking to some industry leaders. We're talking about the gap in trust between the public and electronic consumer products. And my point was that across the board, in the United States in particular, because mostly U.S. based in this case, across the board, over 80% of the U.S. public, Republicans, I think, were like 82, Democrats 86, Independent 85. They wanted legislation. They want strong legislation to protect civil rights and data protection, everything else. And it says clearly it's going to put pressure, especially in an election year, but even going forward, on legislators to do something about it. Unless, of course, the industry finds a way to self-regulate before that time. And I'll tell you, there was very little desire to acknowledge the need to do something. And so I think given that level of perhaps, I don't want to say hubris, but just confidence of where we are, where industry is, I think that we may end up with something stronger, or maybe not as strong as the EU AI Act, but may end up with something that is actually legislation rather than just governing principles. I think that's significant.
Absolutely. And I think as well, if you think about this piece of legislation, right, the reference to the Civil Rights Act, which was a revolutionary piece of legislation in modern U.S. history, and this idea of a bill for an AI Civil Rights Act, drawing attention to the many civil rights harms, or to use language, the bill, the consequence, right, of these algorithms. And one of the things that the bill seeks to address is some under-regulated elements of this process or under-specified elements of this process that are resulting in real harm. So to give listeners an example, pretty much everything you ask for now goes to some algorithm that does an initial sorting. It might not make the final decision, but from things like credit, banking, legal services, healthcare, even like applying for jobs, all these are elements that this bill seeks to cover and draw attention to potential harm, but also the responsibilities of those who are deploying the software and also those who are developing, right? So both developers and users, to use more widely accessible language, right? So these are coming back to something that we've raised often in previous episodes of this podcast, where we're thinking about the impact of algorithmic discrimination, right? But also factoring in algorithmic opacity. And it's an attempt to square that particular circle.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to continue this conversation, oftentimes we think and we make the mistake that the challenges brought to us are presented by AI or emerging technologies are new, right? But the fact of the matter is that we do have the tools to address a lot of this. At heart, what this bill is, it's a privacy bill, right? It's about data privacy. With AI, what you're getting is that you're getting lack of privacy on steroids. We're being offered efficiency in return for complete loss of privacy. We do have laws on the books for privacy. And if we approach these kinds of regulations as this very exotic set of legislative rules and laws because it's AI related, then that complicates the debate. If we strip it down and we say, no, this is about freedom of speech, this is about democracy, this is about data protection, this is about lack of discrimination, we have a pretty well-developed body of law in that direction. And so we're just extending that to in this particular sphere that now is new. And so we just extend that. This reminds me of conversations we also have in the context of international and humanitarian law, then law lethal autonomous weapons systems, where a lot of conversations are, do we need a new set of laws? Do we need a new legal framework altogether to accommodate the lethal autonomous weapons systems? People like Mike Schmidt or Eric Jensen and others will point out and say, no, we don't. We already have it. We just need to apply what we have to lethal autonomous weapons systems and of course, you have to find creative ways to do so. I guess my advice is oftentimes, let's not complicate this. Let's not make this really esoteric conversation about emergent technologies and this becomes prohibiting for most people to engage with. This at heart is an issue of privacy. It's an issue of transparency, an issue of human rights. And we have a lot of experience in that.
Absolutely. And this is a more optimistic note, which brings us back to the Global Digital Compact, where you have the first global commitment to data governance that places it on the agenda and requires member states to take action on this by 2030, right? It's this idea of where you draw the line. And this also brings in, you brought up an example from international humanitarian law, but also international human rights law.
That's right.
Actions are there, right? We just need specification in the context of how these new technologies are mediating relationship between the individual and the state, the individual and society, individual and business, and new forms of discrimination and harm that are coming from that and making sure that we are attentive to it.
Absolutely right.
Thank you, Medlir, for that update from the UN Summit of the Future and some of your insights from your last few days in New York. That's it for today's show. Join us again next time for another discussion at the intersection of law, society, and politics. Until then, stay human.